good afternoon, everybody. My name is Cyril Shukla. Some of you were already here and joined us last week. I'm an outreach coordinator for Crossroads for Hope, formerly known as Cancer Support Committee Central New Jersey. In partnership with Rutgers Cancer Institute of New Jersey, we're happy to welcome you to Understanding Clinical Trials. During today's presentation, you will gain basic understanding of the research development involved in clinical trials and what to expect during the enrollment process. Also learn about the history, how participants are protected, as well as discuss the importance of minority participation in clinical trials. Our presenter today is the lovely Evelyn Fuertes. She's a community cancer control specialist at Rutgers Cancer Institute of New Jersey. If you have any questions, you can drop them in the Q&A box anonymously if you would like, or you could put them in the chat and we will definitely address them at the end of the presentation. Thank you for joining us today, and Evelyn, feel free to take over.
Hi, Harold. Thank you. Let me just pull up the presentation. Thank you, everyone, for spending your day with us. I'm hoping that all you see are my slides. Yes?
Yes, I can see it.
Oh, great. So thank you for taking the time out of your busy days to join us today. Okay, so before I start, I like to always tell a little bit about our team. So we provide education to the community, and we also provide some professional education to, for example, community health workers, tobacco cessation professionals. We work closely with researchers to help them recruit for studies like clinical trials. We work with patient navigators, and we actually have an oncology nurse navigator on our team. So if you ever have any questions or help with navigation, we are more than happy to connect you with that person. And they can answer questions about cancer and treatment or help with scheduling an appointment. We also provide regional assessments so that our partner organizations and researchers are aligning their work with the actual needs within our communities. So I have a pretest here. Haral, I'm not sure, did we?
Yep,
Beautiful.
I have it. So I'm going to walk
Awesome.
through it now.
So this is to see what you know. So right now, there is only one type of clinical trial, true or false. All clinical trials follow a recipe or a strict series of steps. Is that true or false? If you decide to be in a clinical trial, you can't change your mind or leave the trial. Is that true or false? And an institutional review board, they make sure the clinical trial researchers follow safety rules. Is that true or false?
So people are still answering, so as we get close to
let's give them another minute or so.
Yep.
And then what we'll do is we'll review the answers at the end of the presentation. I think we're ready to move on. Okay, so here's what we'll be discussing today. In this presentation, we'll define clinical trials, review the kinds of trials and phases. We'll also discuss the ethics and protections in research and what someone can expect when they participate in a clinical trial. So cancer takes years to develop, and we consider cancer development as the 3 phases of carcinogenesis. Now, this will look familiar for those of you that attended Cancer 101 last week. So carcinogenesis is a fancy way of saying when normal cells are transformed into cancer cells. So these phases include initiation, which are the first cells to mutate, promotion, which is the proliferation of the cancer cells. And I just want to mention briefly that it's during this phase that we screen for cancer prevention. So here's where we're doing our mammograms, pap smears, and looking for those abnormal cells. So cancer prevention activities can prevent and detect cancers early. And progression is that last phase in tumor growth. And this is where that tumor starts to become more invasive and aggressive and can metastasize, which means that the cancer has spread to other parts of the body. So clinical trials can be done at these different time points. So some are for prevention and some are done during treatment. So it's important to note that clinical trials can be done at any point in time. And again, this will be another review slide. This is a very basic overview of the stages of cancer. When cancer is found, it's given a stage. So in stage 0, we have those abnormal cells. They've been found, but since they haven't spread to other tissues, they're not considered cancer. Stages 1 through 3, right? The cancer has been diagnosed. The number represents the size of the tumor and if it's spread to nearby tissue. In stage 4, that cancer has metastasized, means it's spread to other parts of the body. And that could be, breast cancer spreading to a leg bone or colorectal cancer spreading to the lungs. So clinical trials are research studies in people. Many of the medicines we use to treat cancer today went through clinical trials, and many of those everyday medicines we use have also gone through clinical trials. For instance, ibuprofen and allergy medicines. Those have all had to go through clinical trials before being available to the public. So there are a few different kinds of trials. Prevention trials look for better ways to prevent a disease in people who've never had the disease or to prevent the disease from returning. So these kinds of trials can include trials for medicines, vaccines, or lifestyle changes. A timely example would be the COVID vaccine trials that have been taking place. Right? Screening trials test for new ways for detecting disease. For instance, and I'm going to use a lot of COVID examples because it's very timely for this. So Rutgers developed a saliva test for COVID, and that would be an example of a detection method that had to go through a screening trial. And then we have diagnostic trials, and those study or compare tests or procedures for finding a particular disease. So I just want to differentiate between screening and diagnostics. Those are actually two different things. So screening is routine testing for patients without symptoms, and further testing may be done if a screening finds a possible abnormality. So it's for patients without symptoms. Diagnostic testing is to investigate symptoms or a possible abnormality found during a screening. So this is for a patient with symptoms or for patients whose screening showed a possible abnormality. So for instance, you may go for a screening mammogram. That's because it's, you're due for your annual or biannual screening. But then if they found something, you might go for follow-up screening that's really diagnostic because there's symptoms. So they're similar, but I just wanted to make sure that there was an understanding of the two different terms. So treatment trials are for new treatments. So this could be a new combination of drugs, new approaches to surgery or radiation therapy, for example. We have behavioral trials, and these look at behavior changes meant to improve health. And we have quality of life trials. These are also called supportive care trials, and they find ways to improve the comfort and quality of life of people with illnesses. And finally, we have compassionate use trials, and these are ways to provide someone who may not have any options an opportunity to try a new treatment, even if it's not fully approved. And that was something, again, that we saw with the COVID treatments. They're not fully approved, but it provides an opportunity to help people. So clinical trials have 5 phases. The preclinical stage is considered the development and animal testing phase of the drug. So this has to be done to determine if the treatment can work in people, because in this phase, nothing is given to anyone. We have to determine if the drug is safe before being tested on humans. And this phase can take several years. So some of the things that people have noted with the COVID vaccine, for example, is that how quickly the drugs have been through. So something to consider is a lot of times it can take 6 months for just paperwork to go through. So when all of that is expedited, you get something a lot quicker. There was also a lot of research that had been done beforehand. For instance, the genome of the virus had already been mapped. We have SARS-CoV-1 back in the early 2000s. So there was already some background, a lot of background information that the scientists were able to work on. And so that's why that time frame was a lot more condensed. So in phase 1 trials, this is when the researchers start to test a drug in a small group of people. So we're looking at only 20, 80 participants, and this is being tested for the first time in humans. And this is to learn about dosing, which is how much medicine someone can safely take. And they also are going to identify any side effects. So I just want you to note that side effects and safety are always monitored throughout all phases of a clinical trial. Phase 2 trials, now we're giving it to a larger group of people. We're talking a couple hundred, and that's to see if it works like it's supposed to. In phase 3 trials, this is when the drug's given to an even larger group of people. We're talking about thousands at this point, and this is to confirm that it works. Researchers continue to monitor the side effects, and this is where researchers compare it with other similar treatments. In phase 4 trials, these are done after the drug is approved by the FDA. They're the branch of the government that approves drugs, and it's made available to the public. So researchers track the drug safety in the general public, and they're looking for more information about the drug's benefits and optimal use. So this phase studies the side effects caused over time in the general public. So we have a much larger pool of people. And these trials look for side effects that weren't seen in earlier trials and may also look at how the new treatment works over a longer period of time. So let's look at the history of clinical trials. So we think of clinical trials as a modern idea, but they've been around for a long time. The world's first clinical trial is recorded in the book of Daniel in the Bible. So this experiment was conducted by King Nebuchadnezzar and was probably one of the first times that a trial was used to make public health decisions. In 1537, a French surgeon tested a treatment for battlefield wounded soldiers. James Lind, he's considered the first doctor to have concluded a controlled clinical trial of the modern era. So in 1747, Dr. Lind was working as a ship's doctor, and he noticed that a lot of sailors had scurvy. That was very common back then. Scurvy is a disease that comes from a vitamin C deficiency and can kill you if it's not treated. So he planned a comparative trial by giving the sailors different treatments and compared what worked and what didn't. So through trial and error, he found that by giving the sailors limes, he was able to reduce the cases of scurvy on his ship. And this was way before we knew that vitamin C could prevent scurvy. Later research was based on forms of the comparative trial and, for instance, randomized trials. So they use chance and pick people at random and then separate them into different groups. The use of placebos, that compared a treatment with a sugar pill. The sugar pill, that's the placebo, and that measures the psychological effect versus an actual physical effect. In cancer trials, you wouldn't necessarily get, you wouldn't get a placebo or a sugar pill. You would either receive the usual treatment or the new treatment that's being studied. And basically the idea of using a comparative group, that became the standard for clinical trials. So has anyone seen or read The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks? Right? It's a great book. I never got to see the movie, but I hear it's really good as well. That's a great example of unethical research. Henrietta Lacks was an African-American woman that lived near Baltimore. She had a very aggressive type of cervical cancer. She went to Johns Hopkins University Hospital in 1951 to get treated, and the doctors there removed her tumor. And then, without her permission, they took those cells and started to experiment on them. Basically, she didn't give her consent for her cells to be used in experiments. She died shortly after her treatment, and her family wasn't compensated at the time. They didn't find out until 20 years later, and then they were able to get some compensation, but not without a legal battle. So this is significant because her cells became very important in medical research and are still used to this day. So they're called the HeLa immortal cell line. These cells are the oldest and most used cell lines we have. At Hopkins, the committee tasked with deciding who can use those HeLa cells now includes 2 members of the Lacks family. So there has been some improvement. And this isn't unique. There was the Tuskegee study, that we're hearing a lot about now with the COVID vaccine and how it still affects how African Americans deal with the medical community and vice versa. There was Dr. J. Marion Sims, who performed gynecological experiments without anesthesia on Black slaves, even when anesthesia was available. So as we move through history, and as you saw in the previous slide, there were problems with the way people were being treated in medical studies. So in 1947, the Nuremberg Code gave us informed consent, which we'll talk about shortly. And that was as a result of the atrocities committed by Nazi experiments during World War II. In 1974, the U.S. National Research Act was in response to the Tuskegee study, where for 40 years, African American men were deliberately not told they had syphilis and were never treated for it, even when an effective treatment was made available. Like I said in the previous slide, this had a big effect on how African Americans deal with the medical community to this day. In 1997, President Clinton made a formal apology to the survivors and their families. And it's available online if you would like to see it. In 1979, the Belmont Report gave us Institutional Review Board, which we'll also cover later in this presentation, and the importance of respect for persons, beneficence, and justice or equity in research. In 1996, the International Conference on Harmonization made these protections international. So all of these regulations were put into place to protect people when they participate in clinical studies, and they continue to be updated as needed. So as I mentioned, part of the regulations that were put into place was the Institutional Review Board, or IRB. The IRB is a group of people that's a combination of community members and researchers that aren't a part of the study. They review the clinical trial protocol and make sure that all the participants are protected and informed about what's going to happen to them if they participate in a clinical trial. If for any reason you're concerned or feel that something in the clinical trial isn't happening the way it's supposed to, the IRB is who you would go to about those concerns. Later in the presentation, we'll discuss the informed consent and the protocol. So in addition to the IRB, we have other government organizations that also protect individuals. These include the DSMB, or Data and Safety Monitoring Board. They make sure that clinical trials are safe for people to participate in. They're involved in phase 3 of trials and are a part of the NIH, which is also on this list. The FDA, Food and Drug Administration, they oversee and regulate the conduct of clinical trials. So if you recall in the previous slide, they're the ones that mandated the IRB. They're also in charge of the Office of Good Clinical Practice. Then there's the NIH, or National Institutes of Health. They provide funding for a lot of the clinical trials, and they make sure that all of the trials are led by researchers that are trained in the Good Clinical Practice guidelines. And those were the guidelines that we saw implemented in 1996 in the ethical milestone slide. So because protections have been put into place, we can see where research done right can have a positive effect. So here are studies that have been conducted here at the Cancer Institute and have been inclusive and followed the protections that we've just discussed. So the GRACE study helps eligible breast and ovarian cancer survivors get genetic testing. The study focuses on Black, Hispanic, and women living in rural areas who are eligible for genetic testing and aren't necessarily aware of it. In many cases, the hereditary form of breast cancer and ovarian cancer are more aggressive and can present in younger women. So by surveying survivors and helping them with genetic testing, they can help members of their own families screen for cancers much earlier and before getting any symptoms, which is a goal for cancer screening, since in many cases when you have symptoms, the cancer is more advanced and harder to treat. In the Women's Circle of Health study, that's an inclusive breast cancer study that evaluates the causes of an early age and more aggressive form of breast cancer in Black women. So the study is a collaborative effort between Rutgers Cancer Institute of New Jersey, Roswell Park Comprehensive Cancer Center, the New Jersey State Cancer Registry, and the Rutgers School of Public Health. So participants are recruited in 10 counties throughout New Jersey. In 2014, with additional funding from NCI, that's the National Cancer Institute, the study was enhanced and redesigned as a cohort study of Black breast cancer survivors. So this follow-up study evaluates the impact of obesity and related comorbidities or other chronic disease conditions, which are seen in high amounts in this population. And it also looks at the quality of life and patient-reported outcomes and survival. This third study is a targeted gene study for non-small cell lung cancer. So while the first two were behavioral health studies, now we know that what those are, this falls under precision medicine because they're targeting specific gene mutations in the tumor for eligibility. So in a very simplified way of explaining, targeted therapies can work by inhibiting or suppressing gene action that would cause or induce the tumor to grow and or spread. So let's talk about the consent form. That's required before the clinical trial. It'll tell you what to expect, the purpose, risks, and benefits. It also makes sure to outline the importance of your privacy and keeping your health information confidential. And very importantly for a lot of people, it covers if there's any cost to you or payments for participation. And in many cases, most of the costs are covered by the drug makers or insurance. So the informed consent is supposed to give you a crystal clear understanding of any associated costs. This is also an opportunity for the participant to ask any questions about the clinical trial. So someone would only sign the informed consent when they've had all of their questions answered and they're comfortable with participating in the trial. So remember, participating in a trial is 100% voluntary. The consent process is ongoing, and you can withdraw or leave the clinical trial at any time for any reason. And the protocol is like a recipe. So it gives you all of the information that's needed before you can start the clinical trial. So this includes how long, how many people, reasons as to why someone might not be eligible for a clinical trial. So think of it as a recipe for the researchers. And what are the steps the researchers take in a clinical trial? So the process moves along step by step, and like anything, starts with an idea. So the following steps include the experiment design. Think of that recipe we just talked about. The IRB we mentioned earlier, make sure that participants are protected. Once the protections are in place, the participants are enrolled in the study started, completed, and analyzed, and then finally the results are shared. So just like the researchers have a step-by-step approach, here's what people can expect in the clinical trial process. So you, with your healthcare provider, will talk about the steps in participating in the trial, and we'll take each one separately here. So once that diagnosis has been made, you'll work with your medical team to determine whether or not you would like to participate in or are eligible for a clinical trial. So clinical trial participation involves shared decision-making. So it focuses on the participant, and it can improve communication between the participant and the healthcare team. It can lead to better satisfaction and reduces inequalities by helping people understand information in a way that would benefit them. So these decisions are made with your values in mind and by honoring your best interests. If you decide to participate in a clinical trial, you'll be informed of the risks, benefits, costs associated, if any, and the protocol. Like I mentioned before, once you fully understand the process, and only if you agree to it, then you'll need to sign the informed consent. Trial participants, and I can't stress this enough, the participation in a clinical trial is 100% voluntary, and it's an ongoing process. So you can withdraw or leave a clinical trial at any time for any reason. And during the clinical trial, you'll still be working with your medical team and, depending on the outcomes, continue the treatment. Many times participants feel that they get better care because they're followed so closely during a trial. And once the clinical trial is completed, you and your doctor will talk about your next steps, and you may consider participating in other trials. For instance, there's that follow-up for the Women's Circle of Health study I mentioned earlier. Okay, so remember when I mentioned earlier that regulations were put into place? So this was to protect people in clinical studies because of past abuses. Historically, shared decision-making, that wasn't part of the research process. And as we saw, abuses in vulnerable populations has led to mistrust, where we see the effects to this day. So we're seeing it now with the COVID vaccine. And these are legitimate concerns. In addition to participant mistrust, we can also see the effect when researchers are hesitant to include trial participants because of fears of harming people. You know, pregnant women comes to mind, for example. So because of mistrust and researcher hesitancy, certain groups do not participate in clinical trials. And this can affect the results of the trial because we don't really know how these missing groups will respond to treatment. So this can lead to poor treatment outcomes for these groups. And we generally see this with race, gender, and age. So for instance, there is a difference with triple negative breast cancer. Because of genetics, African-American women have a higher risk. We also see this with obesity and the Asian population. The negative effects of obesity are seen at a much lower BMI. And that's just based on genetics. And both that Grace and Women's Circle of Health studies, those were both inclusive of race and genders that used to be excluded from a lot of studies. Another one that comes to mind for me specifically is the Framingham study. That's a lot of the heart attack information that we have. A lot of the common heart attack symptoms that we know about are for men, because that study didn't include as many women. So it wasn't until many years later that we've realized that women actually have very different symptoms for heart attacks. So just an example of how important it is having that inclusivity. Another reason we need diversity is we just don't have a good representation of tissue samples. So the majority of the samples we do have are from people of European descent. And without diverse tissue samples, again, we have a harder time creating those effective treatments that are for everyone. So why should I participate in a clinical trial? What's in it for me, right? And that's a very valid question. So participating in a clinical trial can be a hard decision, especially if you aren't sure how it can benefit you. Studies are only considered when the benefits far outweigh the risks. And here are some of the pros and cons of participating in a clinical trial. Right, so we have early access to new life-saving or life-extending treatment. Right, the new treatment may be superior to the standard treatment, and standard treatment would be just the regular treatment that they're doing. And like I mentioned before, people in clinical trials feel they get better care. And then for the un- and underinsured participants, many drug makers do cover the costs of the drugs being tested. For people that are terminal, their lives may be extended long enough to just get their affairs in order, say their goodbyes. If it's a hereditary illness, you may be helping others in your own family, like in that Grace study I talked about earlier. Some studies may pay or provide participants an incentive. Have you ever received a gift card for filling out a survey? In the GRACE study, participants were paid $50 per assessment. With 4 assessments, that was $200 in their pocket. So now let's look at some of the cons. That can include the treatment doesn't work or work as expected. You might have some uncomfortable side effects, more time needed for treatments, right? You have more doctor visits. If there's travel, you may have to travel more. If you have to travel far, you may need to book hotels. So that's an added cost that might not be covered by the study. Some behavioral health studies provide childcare, but that's generally an exception. That's not the norm. And clinical trials are very important to the development of new medicines and to keep us healthy. So while there's still some barriers, researchers today are really trying very hard to include as many people as possible so that treatment options can help improve the health of our communities and future generations. And speaking of future generations, the future of clinical trials may also include studies of genes and our immune system. So these studies can result in medicines and therapies that are personalized to you as an individual. And this is important, especially now that we know that there are differences within the genetics of different groups. And for that non-small cell lung cancer study I spoke about earlier, that's an example of precision or personalized medicine. So if you look at this image, that drug is targeting the star, that purple star. So those people with the purple star, it's precision to personalized treatment for them. And technology can be a useful tool to collect data and help people safe during clinical trials. So it's a way for people to communicate easily with their healthcare providers and make it easier to participate in a clinical trial. And when you think about it, that's really the goal, making it easier to participate in a clinical trial and letting you know why it's important, right? Helping researchers find the best ways for people to stay healthy and to create better tests and treatments that can help you now and in the future. And when you think about it, that's really the goal, making it easier to participate in that clinical trial and letting you know why it's important. So we saw that there are various kinds of trials and they all must follow the protocol set in place, right? Guidelines have been put into place to keep people safe. And by participating in clinical trials, you're helping researchers find the best ways for people to stay healthy and to create better tests and treatments that can help everyone, right? We want to make this as inclusive as possible. And here are some resources. I will provide her all a PDF version and make all these links clickable so that if anyone has any questions or would like to search for trials, the Rutgers Cancer Institute, our website does have a find a trial function, but here are a whole slew of other areas that you can look, and that which include the National Cancer Institute and the American Cancer Society, among others.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And I'm going to launch the post-test goal, and then we'll go over the questions.
Fantastic. So, number 1, there's only one type of clinical trial. True or false? All clinical trials follow a recipe or a strict series of steps. True or false? If you decide to be in a clinical trial, you cannot change your mind and you cannot leave the trial. True or false? Lastly, an institutional review board, IRB, makes sure the clinical trial researchers follow safety rules. True or false? We'll give everyone a couple of minutes to answer the post-test, and then we will review the answers. And I will take a drink during this break.
Okay, go for it. Okay, there's some people still answering, so I'm going to pause.
That's awesome. We've got plenty of time.
Yes,
take their time.
This brought me back to college.
Not in a scary way, I hope.
No, I mean, I'm a public health major, so, you know, we had to go through everything.
Oh, yes. A lot of this probably review.
Exactly.
All right. So fantastic.
For the first
so there is only one type of clinical trial, and everybody, you got it. All clinical trials follow a recipe or a strict series of steps. That is true. And this is a great group because we're getting these. If you decide to be in a clinical trial, you can't change your mind and leave the trial. That is false, 100% false. And the IRB makes sure the clinical trial research follows safety rules. True, 100% true. That is fantastic. I love it. I love it.
No, you guys passed.
You guys rocked. So now let me know if we rocked. And this should be the correct, I checked the link, it's the correct one. So if you can please take a moment, you can either click on, there's 2 links there. If some people can't get to a bit.ly, so I've included the original Qualtrics link, or if it's easier for you and you want to use the QR code, you could just hold that up to the screen and it should, the evaluation should pop up as well. Okay. And if anyone has any questions, I could do my best to answer them.
I don't have any questions in the Q&A box. Let me check the chat. There's nothing in the chat either.
I don't see any.
Okay.
Oh, great. Okay, so I will leave this up for another few seconds. And again, if anyone has any questions, feel free to use the chat. Feel free to use the Q&A. And I will, here we go. Where's the, there we go. And thank you for joining us. If for whatever reason, you don't have a question now, but something pops up later, you're more than welcome to reach out to us, and ask. And we have all of our information here.
Yes. And I also shared the link to the clinical trials website. If there's a specific clinical trials that you're looking for, specific to a disease that you want to take part in, you can go on clinicaltrials.gov and really search to see if there are any clinical trials that you could be part of, just to help expand our research.
Yeah.
This could be from chronic diseases to cancer to anything in between.
Yes. And I just want to mention something that I honestly wasn't aware of until I started working for the Cancer Institute. So we have a fairly low enrollment rate for adults in clinical trials, whereas in pediatrics, as soon as a child is diagnosed with cancer, they're automatically they start the clinic, like they start the process of enrolling them in a clinical trial ASAP. Childhood cancers have a much higher survival rate, better outcomes because of this. So, you know, we would do anything for our kids. So it makes sense that they're going to, you know, people will enroll in trials, enroll them in a trial. Whereas the adults, we don't see that as often, but we have to start thinking of that same approach. You want to do whatever you can. And a lot of people think of clinical trials as the last resort. It's actually not. As you saw, we have behavioral trials, there's screening, there's such a variety of clinical trials that if your doctor suggests a trial, it's not because it's a last resort, but it's because it's an opportunity. So I just want to put that out there as well.
Yeah, and just going back to informed consent, the informed consent is really meant to be at like a 3rd or 5th grade level reading. Yes. So the community can understand, you know, we don't yes. go into a doctor's office hoping to be able to know all the scientific words and the jargon, the medicine jargon. So in order to make it easier to understand what goes on in a clinical trial, it varies by institution, but the informed consent are supposed to be at either a 5th grade or a 3rd grade level. To make it more inclusive for the minority community to be able to understand as well. And yeah. If language is a barrier, mostly all institutions now have informed consent translated into different languages or have interpreter services that can help make the decision as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And no one is expected to sign an informed consent if they don't feel comfortable.
Absolutely. And you can say to the doctor, hey, I will take the informed consent back home. I would like to read it through. You can schedule a second appointment just to make sure you go over any questions you may have regarding the trial. And like Evelyn said, everything is voluntary. So at any point you want to do come off, you can. They just have to make sure that if you're on a medication or if it's a therapeutic clinical trial, they have to do proper testing just to make sure that you're safe enough to get off of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And other than that, I don't have anything else. We don't have any questions, but that concludes today's presentation.